The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen isn't a good movie on its own, nor is it a good adaptation of the comics by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill. In my videos on Aragon or Battlefield Earth, my rule was to ignore the books I hadn't read and think of basic improvements on the movies. I'll still kind of be doing that, since my solution to improving this movie is not going to be just do it more like the comic. But you will hear me refer back to the comic quite a bit, so keep that in mind. Adapting this comic is a minefield. The first 6 issues, which this movie is roughly adapting, are a slow burn, mostly filled with Mina recruiting the members of her team, and the actual conflict of the story taking up the last 2 issues of the story. If this movie followed that structure, it'd be a really unbalanced story. Boring in the first half and then breakneck action in the second. That's no good. But the movie chose to kinda take the team from the comics and insert them into a pretty generic action movie. The comic has some problems, and not just in structure, but it does have some interesting stuff going on. This movie chose to discard all of that. There are some aspects that would have been difficult to translate to screen while respecting copyright law, like the Invisible Man not in the public domain at the time this movie was made. Also, Fu Manchu, a character already wrapped in racially charged history as well as copyright infringement, which meant the comics had to be very careful how they used him, so it's probably best the movie didn't use this character. But even getting past the problems of adapting this comic, this movie makes several bizarre choices I cannot defend. Let's do a car chase in the middle of Venice in the 1800s. Let's add a hot, sexy Tom Sawyer, who, according to Mark Twain canon, would have been about Alan Quatermain's age by this time period. This was done to attract American audiences, but look at Doctor Who, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Sherlock Holmes. Americans don't need an American in the cast to pique our interest. Instead of the team being manipulated into helping a criminal mastermind eliminate his rival, the movie says, wouldn't it be cool if there were evil versions of the League? Moriarty gathering the League so he could recreate them as soldiers to sell to other countries begs the question, why did he need Quatermain? If he's here to capture Mr. Hyde, why did Moriarty need Hyde? He already had Nemo, Mina, and Skinner. That's more than enough weird stuff to sell to other countries, but I guess because Quatermain is in the comic, he has to be in the movie. What would I have done differently? I wouldn't use the Murray League. Use one of the previous teams hinted at in the comics. Prospero from Shakespeare's The Tempest had a group in the early 1600s, and Lemuel Gulliver from Gulliver's Travels had a team in the late 1700s. At the time, the audience knew nothing about what these groups had done in the history of this world. So if the movie was set on creating a brand new story, I imagine fans wouldn't be so upset since you're not trampling on the comics so much. Stick to the team lineup shown in these brief glimpses of these teams and don't do a car chase in the time of Shakespeare and you're all set. But if you have to use the Murray League, don't cast Sean Connery. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but a lot of the problems with this movie stem from him being in it. Comic book Quatermain was an opium addict who was once a mighty hero who fell into dark times and rises back to something closer to what he once was. Connery saying he didn't want to do that means what for the character in this movie? He's an awesome action hero at the beginning, middle, and end of the movie. There's no growth for the character. He has a surrogate son in Tom Sawyer, and I do like this relationship, but that's not much of a character arc. He talks about bringing his son on adventures and having to bury him, so taking Tom under his wing makes Quatermain seem worse. I don't think you can or should adapt the League comic scene for scene, but portraying Quatermain as a shell of his former self and showing him slowly become more heroic throughout the movie is more interesting than what the movie chose to do. So do that. Connery wanting to play Quatermain as a traditional hero relegates Mina Murray's role to a side character. I don't know if one of Connery's demands was that Quatermain also be the leader of the team, or if that was the natural progression the story took from we have an A-list movie star and we have to make him happy to he wants his character to be less of a mess to he's now the leader of the team. In the comics, Mina was the smartest member of the team and made most of the decisions. I guess the movie thinks it's making up for this by turning her into a vampire, since in the novel Dracula, she is bitten by Dracula. But having her be a normal person who is smart and can command respect from a Hulk like Mr. Hyde, that's more impressive than a passive and forgettable character who can turn into a swarm of bats, and her only contribution to the movie is killing Dorian Gray. So if we have someone else playing Quatermain as a barely functioning recovering drug addict, then make Mina the leader. Maybe there should be a thread of detective work with the League trying to figure out who the Phantom is and what his goals are. In the movie, the Phantom attacks the team when they're trying to recruit Dorian Gray, and one of the Phantom's henchmen screams, "Run, James!" Next time we see him, he reveals himself to be the guy who puts the team together. Then, at the North Pole, Quatermain has pieced together that James is James Moriarty, the arch-nemesis of Sherlock Holmes, who was believed to be dead as of the Holmes story, The Final Problem. How did Quatermain figure this out? There's lots of Jameses out there, and don't tell me Quatermain, who was in Africa for I'd wager at least a decade, knew what Moriarty looked like from newspapers. That's not gonna fly. In the comics, Nemo secretly sent the Invisible Man to follow their handler, only to discover Moriarty's plan to bomb Fu Manchu's criminal empire. That doesn't take much detective work, but it makes more sense than Quatermain pulling a name out of thin air and being right. The movie has the Invisible Man staking out Moriarty's lair before the League arrives. You could have had a scene where he reconnoiters with the team. You remember a few years back that big to-do at Reichenbach Falls? Guess what? That would be fine. I'm not sure why Moriarty himself is recruiting the team. Maybe it would be weird if some bad guy our less bibliophilic audiences might not know just showed up in the final act. Yes, it was I who told my good chap Campion to recruit this team. Bwahaha! Even if you know about Sherlock Holmes, that would come out of nowhere if you're just watching this movie. Even though one of those people would have probably heard of the Napoleon of crime, making it risky for him to show his face to the team he intends to use and abuse, I get why he's the one recruiting the team narratively. But just one line of dialogue could make this seem less weird. Sherlock Holmes was the only man who ever came face to face with Moriarty. It was public knowledge there was some Victorian kingpin, but nobody saw his face. Knowing he was ready to make one last job before retiring, he thought he needed to come forward to play the League like a fiddle. I've already talked about how weird it is that Tom Sawyer is in the movie, so he's out. Likewise, Dorian Gray is not in the team in the comics, and his presence here and the focus on his romance with Mina forces Captain Nemo out of the main character zone. Nemo was a character I get the feeling Moore and O'Neill liked, but couldn't think of much to do with him, so they gave more screen time to his family in the sequels. But just because Nemo was basically there to transport the team in the comics doesn't mean that has to be his only role in the movie. I like the exchange between Quatermain and Nemo when they first meet. It makes sense they would be hostile to each other. But after that, I don't think they talk to each other in the rest of the movie. Play more with Nemo having issues with taking orders from someone half his age, especially on his boat. If Moriarty actually is part of the British government, play with Nemo's distrust against the country he warred against in the past, which, if you do get a sequel, could set up his reasons for leaving the team near the end of the Martian War. There's lots of things you could do with Nemo which would be better than what the movie gave him. Who should the traitor be? Well, there doesn't have to be a traitor in this movie. In the comics, the Invisible Man betrayed the team during the Martian War. You could save his betrayal for then, provided the movie is good enough to warrant a sequel. Even though you've created a brand new Invisible Man, he could be just as treacherous as the one in the comics. So I'm not sure why they would take that away from him and give it to someone who isn't even supposed to be in the movie. Since I don't like Moriarty creating evil versions of the League, what would the plot of the movie be? You could replace Fu Manchu with some other crime lord from Victorian literature. In the comics, Captain Nemo has a sort of respectful rivalry with Captain Moores, a German air pirate, and Robert the Conqueror, a French air pirate. Maybe Moriarty wants to eliminate these men, agents of their own respective governments. Then he can start a world war and profit from the aftermath. It's sloppy, but maybe Moriarty has some backup plans to benefit him while everyone scrambles around him. Or the comics involve a character named Sulan Kavor from the H.G. Wells novel The First Men in the Moon. You could find some reason Moriarty is trying to sabotage this trip to the moon in that novel. Perhaps he's affiliated with some of the characters from the Jules Verne novel From the Earth to the Moon from a few decades earlier. Perhaps one or more of the characters in that novel aren't too keen on a new expedition that might undercut what they did. I don't know if that would be in character. You couldn't pay me enough money to read From the Earth to the Moon after my experience with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but using multiple different sources of literature, that's what the League is all about, so you could find something fun to do with Moriarty's motivations. Making this movie had to be difficult, but they still made a bad movie, and it didn't have to be, or at least it didn't have to be as bad as it was. That's it for now. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, I'll be back in the future with something else. Until next time, have a good one.